Hi. You guys are on
Yeah, it's right.
it. Okay. So, um, just give me a second. Okay. I think everyone is able to hear me. Okay. So this is the topic I'm going to present today. Training a helpful and harmless assistant with reinforcement learning from human feedback. Based on the research present in this paper, they mentioned that there has been a lot of work going on in training a helpful and harmless assistant. So, before I begin the objective of this paper, I want to show you this comparison table that what these people call their model as RLHF, that is reinforcement learning with human feedback, and with some of the popular models like Lambda and Instruct GPT. So we see that in RLHF and in Lambda and Instruct GPT, both of them, all three of them actually use the human data to train the large language models. Whereas if you see the below three comparisons here, they are all the differences between these models and Lambda and Instruct GPT. So in RLHF, they introduce this notion of helpfulness and harmlessness. Whereas in Lambda, they also include the notions of both positive interactions and harmlessness. We'll discuss what they mean by helpfulness and harmlessness. Whereas in Instruct GPT, only the notion of harmlessness is not included, although they do train for helpfulness, but not for harmlessness. RLHF uses purely reinforcement learning for their training, whereas Lambda uses a mix of supervised learning techniques. Instruct GPT does use RL along with supervised learning techniques. The main key highlight of RLHF is that it uses online training to progressively train their data to generate higher quality. And when I say they use online training, what they basically mean is that they update their data on a weekly basis using a cadence system. And when so this is what it is meant by online training, that they keep on getting streams of data which they update regularly to enhance their data set quality. Whereas Lambda, it does not use online training. Same with Instruct GPT, it also does not use online training. Now, let's come back to the objective. So the objective want to, which they have presented in the paper is that they want to fine tune large language models using preference modeling and reinforcement learning from human feedback. Human feedback does play a key role. Yeah. So human feedback does play a very important key role in their research. And also they want to develop techniques to train AI agents which are helpful, honest, and harmless. So in the research, they mostly focus on helpfulness and harmlessness. Honesty term, when we go when we see the results, so they find out that honesty, the samples, they tend to have honesty as an attribute, even though they did not train it explicitly for honesty. So it came out as a finding later on, uh, after their training. So, when we say what they are doing and what they are not doing, so they are not defining the definitions for helpfulness or honesty or harmlessness. They are instead using crowd workers' knowledge to judge what helpfulness and harmlessness mean. So they are not explicitly quantifying some metrics to judge whether it's a harmless or a helpful conversation going on. Because even I personally believe that that would be somewhat difficult to quantify in a certain matrix. So they are not defining the definitions. This is one thing very clear in their paper. So they are using, that is what the paper says also, that they're using human feedback. So this is what they mean by human feedback. So this is the architecture. I'm going to come to the architecture later on, and we are going to step by step understand the process they are trying to follow. And when I explain the process, there might be certain details which I might miss related to that. For that, we can refer the paper to get to the specific details. But I'm going to give an overview of how they have proceeded with the research. So the first step and one of the major part of the research was this data collection process. Here they have used human feedback knowledge. So before this sample, let's see what were the types of data set they collected. So they collected data set based on helpfulness and harmlessness. When in the helpfulness, what they did was that they made the crowd workers ask open-ended questions to the model, and questions appear to be like this. Like I have to come up. So if you read the first uh, question which the human asks is, I have to come up with a conversation with an AI assistant for the purposes of showing it off in a demo. What sort of conversation topics would you recommend? This was an actual question a human asked, and the assistant replies, I think the best topics for conversation are common themes and interests, and so on, things like weather, sports. Then again, the human asks a question. I think I'm more interested in advanced conversation. And like that, then they give the options to choose. If you see this part here, A and B. So, the human selects which is more helpful and which is not so helpful based on these prompts. So the more helpful conversation, or the statement is being recorded. In case of harmlessness, also the more harmful response from the model is being recorded. However, the authors do propose somewhere that if their model, would if the human crowd worker would have recorded a less harmful conversation, then they might have improved the accuracy of the model better. So their main their main key point was that for harmlessness specifically, they wanted to define some red teaming task, and they wanted to explicitly study how a more helpful conversation and a more harmful response would mix together and give a response in such a way that it is helpful but not harmful. So uh, instead of taking the direct approach as in case of helpfulness, they did a reverse approach for harmlessness. But they do propose somewhere in their research that we could have done better by training for less harmful conversations. So initially what these guys did, that they took a base model, HHH context distilled 52 billion language model. Then they took out these responses from the crowd workers, and they generated with the help of crowdsourced workers, which they call rejection sampling data set. From this, then they trained using their reinforcement learning policy, and then they call it as an RLHF fine-tuned model, which they update on regular basis. That is the iterated online data set. So after this, so now here, if I go back to the architecture, right? So we have a pre-trained language model, and here they have HHH prompt context distillation. So this was what they have collected. And later on, this part will go into your reinforcement learning. And here we will go to preference modeling. And then comes the human feedback data set, which they fine tune. And again, there is a preference model which goes back into your reinforcement learning. So the main key which differentiated their research with others was the way they collected the data set using a human. So after they have collected all the data sets, they did a preference modeling to classify scores for helpfulness and both for harmlessness. For that, they use 7 language models with parameters count running from 13 million to 15 billion. What they also wanted to study in their research was that they wanted to study the parameter size, that how with the increase in the parameter size their model could perform better. So you can see this was what was presented in their research, with the number of parameters going up for helpful data and harmless data and HH mixture. It's also increasing up. Also, they also say that their model performs better than the other models with similar sizes. So that is also which they say in their research. So this is what they show. If you see the left side of the picture, they show that the learning curves for preference model accuracy when training on a mixture of static helpfulness. So when we say static helpfulness, it means that the model yet doesn't have the human feedback. It's just the uh, raw version of the language model, which has examples for both stat helpfulness and harmlessness. And in the right sides, they also show that how the model size is dependent on static preference and model accuracy. Mostly when I was reading their paper, they did it for one epoch because uh, of the computational limits and everything. And they also specify that we tried most of our examples or evaluations present in the paper are on static, because by the time they were writing their paper, their online mode was still in progress. So they did not have so many examples or so many results on the online online mode of training. So that is also one point they highlight. And for the preference modeling, how they did it in detail is being present in the paper. So for preference modeling, there is not so many details present, like the way they used it or approached it. Whereas for the reinforcement learning, the exact techniques and the exact details and the exact policy they followed is present in the paper. So once the preference modeling, once the preference model has been generated, they use reinforcement technique on top of that. For preference modeling, they haven't presented exact details how they trained their preference models, but for reinforcement learning they have presented almost in exact, there's a clarity for reinforcement learning, whereas for preference model there is not so much clarity in their paper. So if you see here in the architecture, I'll go back once more. Here, the initial policy, RLHF, PPO, and these policies, and then this human feedback goes and come back again. So this whole part is where they classify their reinforcement learning technique. And here is the preference model. And so it's all in a loop. Then in the reinforcement learning, so they have taken somebody else's idea, which they have referred in the paper, and they say that we used their idea. Uh, One second, I have that also. Um, yeah, so they have used referred Steinen 2022 paper, and this is how Steinman defines the idea for training, and this is what they have specified in their paper, that we have used their idea to do the reinforcement learning from human feedback. So if so they so how exactly the approach which they have used is this only. So they prepare a data set for comparisons, and then you train a preference model to assign a higher score for better item in each comparison. And then in the context of human feedback experiments, this is how they did that. For each comparison, it consists of a prompt followed by a pair of model generated responses. Then a PM score is evaluated at the end of each response. Whereas, so here, if you here, so this is how they define or calculate the PM score. In reality, this PM score only is the reward, and uh, and yeah, and the policy in, so they have defined this thing in their research that each response which is generated by the policy is a time step, the PM score is the reward which is at the end, and the whole full conversation is one trajectory. So these are the terminologies they have defined when they are training using reinforcement learning. And the details on how exactly or what the policy was is being presented in the paper, which I have not covered in the slides. I figured out that there were two important key findings from their paper. First of all, that their model improves on almost all of the NLP evaluations. And the samples, they also showed honesty, even though the model wasn't explicitly trained for that attribute. So apart from other key contributions like creating their own data set, using human feedback in the loop, I figured out that these were the final important key results in the research. And this actually fascinated me that how the results were being more honest, despite that they were not even trained for that. And also, one thing they mention in their research somewhere is that there is a tension between helpfulness and harmlessness. So, if I am trying to be more helpful, then it might happen that I might become harmful to somebody. Because if I ask somebody, hey, tell me this, tell me about this. So, I'm trying to be more helpful, but I might have the intentions which are harmful. So they say that we do not want that. Even if you cannot ask a harmful question to the model in the context of being helpful. So their model actually declined such responses whenever any harmful request was being to the model. So it says that it's a harmful. So I'm not going to, reply to that. So this is one thing, and this is one important thing which they have highlighted in their research, that there is a certain tension between helpfulness and harmlessness. That is the reason they decided to, mix both these attributes together in their data set. So this was one important thing which was present in the research apart from these others. So I'm open to questions if you have any.
The HH mixture graph that you showed earlier.
Right.
So that is very, yeah, that one. So it is actually overfitting very properly only, right? So how will you answer that? Like that is a model, that HH mixture is our model,
Yes.
that we are taking the harmful and the
Yes.
because the
So
other ones
that
are
is what they
deviating.
so that is what they did. So they had a helpful data set and a harmless data set. So they had both these data sets. I think some 65,000 samples were present in helpful and some 35,000 were for harmless. That is why they say that there is a certain tension between both of these things, because they wanted to incorporate both of them together. So
What is the definition of honesty that they have?
they have simply mentioned that based on our crowdsourced worker, we judge them to be honest. They, as such, they haven't provided any definition for either of those terms.
Ask me a question. Say I don't know.
Hmm.
Can that be termed as honesty? I generally don't know.
That can be termed, but they are defining honesty in the response from the model side. So if a model says, I don't know, then you can say that if really the model does not know, it can be honesty.
This counteracts the Google's work. It says that we want to look at avoidance and redirect. So if I avoid someone's offensive response, I would consider as avoid, right?
Right.
I want to train my model to avoid giving a response to an offensive comment,
Right.
right? And that is one category. Other category is that I redirect the user
Right.
if I don't want to answer that question, right? So let's say Surjadeep asked me a question about that. Let's say the question is about alcoholism, right? I want to redirect it, right? So I can say that this is alcohol and music are often something that the people use together. Can I redirect the user to music? Now, if I use that method, can I say my agent is honest?
You cannot say the agent was honest, in my
Right.
opinion.
So honesty will be achieved if I were able to say that with respect to this reference of knowledge that I have, this is the best answer I can give.
Right. You can say that it is creating a less harmful conversation, still not violating, uh, helpfulness. So it's being helpful in the case that it's redirecting to music. It's less harmful, and it is honest, in my opinion, when you say that it actually redirects you to music. So in its entire conversation, it's honest, at least in the sense that it's redirecting you to music. It's avoiding you. It's never telling you I don't know about alcohol. It says that would it be a better way if you would want to listen to music. So in that way it achieves all the three parameters. If
So
it yeah
if you define honesty, would you define honesty with respect to sustainability, or you want to define honesty as an emergent capability of a model coming out of the training that has been done on the model?
So if I say honesty, so like I look at it in this way. Honest responses can be very, very harmful sometimes. In normal life, we also say that sometimes it's better to not be truthful about something because it might lead to, fights, or it might lead to disturbances. So sometimes we say, even in a normal day to day life, it's best to not be honest. The counter way which you mentioned could be avoidance and redirecting. So we want our model to be honest but safe. That is what, in my opinion, the real definition of honesty would mean. Now you can counter with the fact that everything has to be honest, but we want our AI agent to be both safe, be ethical as well, follow the moral principles also. So morality and honesty should go hand in hand.
And in the reinforcement learning scenario, did they say specifically that the model learned honesty based on the specific way of feedback mechanism that the crowd workers or the people who were analyzing that system?
So they did not make that analysis as per my knowledge, but I can have a look at it also as well. So there is one line which they have mentioned at the end of their discussions somewhere, where they mention that our model learns honesty even though we trained, though they did not mention this, but they never trained the model for honesty per se. But they say that model, our responses turned out to be honest as well.
And then it makes sense that honesty is kind of a perception that they're making.
Yeah.
Not exactly the term honesty as it uses in the real world.
And also, yeah, exactly. That's why they say that this is one thing we don't do. We don't define their definitions. We use our crowd workers' knowledge, like based on their suitability. So we can also say that there might be certain biasness. A crowd worker, we all are different human beings. What might be honest or helpful or harmless to me might not be for same for you.
So what did they use some kind of a rating mechanism to define?
So they say that we have certain experts. Some number was 650 or something. They took those experts and they judged it.
And they were separate from the one who gave the feedback.
Uh, they are the ones which are feeding, which are which are in the prompt generation and giving the feedback.
But there is no blind evaluation on this study.
No. But it was very interesting to me.
Published paper?
I think
It's a report.
it's a long report. I haven't checked actually.
No, I have one. Oh, suppose when they a prompt, then like A or B, this, or which is more Indian culture.
So sometimes parents say, right, for example, like, I sacrifice my entire life so my daughter can like have a great life ahead. So in that sentence, it's not harmful, but it's a kind of emotion. Yes. And sometimes the agents always take implicitly the word sacrificed. So, like in that way, whether it will be considered as harmful, no, whether it will be taken as a suggestion or something. This kind of scenarios where you need to look for other, you have to understand the context. Right?
That is actually at the discretion of the crowdsource worker who is feeding that data. They are labeling it, but they are not labeling it like 0-1 ratio. They're just choosing whether it's which is more, and that is how they're assigning certain scores. So they have left it at the discretion.
You know Reddit, right? Everyone knows Reddit has the different policies for every community.
And they mention about Reddit as
If
well
I
here.
if I'm talking about my family issues in relationship advice, they will flag it and they will delete my post. But that is not ethical in that community,
Mm.
right? Yeah. If I let's say I take 5-10 communities, I take their content and I identify topics. So I define what is family issues, what is relationship advice, what is harmfulness, and what is helpfulness through a crowdsource mechanism. This is a crowdsource mechanism.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And then I train my model in a RLHF format.
Mm.
But this human feedback would now come from this lexicon or this information rather than human feedback. And then I do a blind evaluation on whether it's a harmful evaluation or it's a helpful. Harmful response or it's a helpful response. Right? Did they also measure the question generation as well? Any follow-up
It's a dialogue based.
Yeah.
So you can consider it as a question answer. Some way, because
they did not evaluate questions
Mm.
in the study.
So they do the dialogue based thing, which in some ways question answer, I feel.
No, there's a difference, right? If I say question answering, it is like Sujadeep asked
Just one question,
I
yeah.
give an answer.
Right.
Or Abhishek asked me a question, I gave an answer. Dialogue would be if he asks a question, I give an answer, then he asks another
Yeah,
question.
it's a continuous conversation.
So
Exactly.
that is important whether this study actually focus on the harmfulness or helpfulness in the conversation sphere or whether it's a question answer.
So they are doing the dialogue based. This
So
is what they did.
They should have measured question generation as well. Whether the asked question,
Probably.
follow-up question is safe or not.
That I might have to give a thorough read if they have explicitly defined it. Because what I have read is that mostly they are doing this dialogue based. Everywhere they're mentioning dialogues and dialogues.
But there is no explicit
About question answer.
generation.
Nothing.
Okay. We will stop here and we move to the next presentation.